Good evening, everyone. My name is Linda Oppenheim. Want to put me on?
You're on.
Great. I'm a board member of Not in Our Town Princeton, and I'm happy to welcome you to Not in Our Town's continuing conversation on race and white privilege. We are hosted by the Princeton Public Library, which has been a steadfast partner in our work for years. I've been asked to let you know that this presentation is being live streamed and recorded. When we go into the breakout rooms, however, those sessions will not be recorded. Not in Our Town is a racial justice organization founded in 1998. Since its inception, Not in Our Town has held events to educate and raise community awareness of continuing racism and to promote activities to combat it. For over a decade, Not in Our Town's continuing conversations have taken place on the first non-holiday Monday of each month to provide the opportunity for people from different backgrounds to hear speakers and to talk to each other about race-related topics. If you would like to be added to our email list, and we send only 1 or 2 messages a month, I'll put my email in the chat and feel free to send me your name and email address. Now, I'm happy to introduce my fellow board member, Joyce Trotman-Jordan, to read the land acknowledgement and the Not in Our Town mission statement. Joyce?
Joyce, do you need to unmute?
Continually. Thank you. All right. The land on which this house stands is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenni Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenni Lenape diaspora.
And our mission statement?
Not in Our Town Princeton is a multiracial, multi-faith group of individuals who stand together for racial justice and inclusive communities. Our focus is to promote the equitable treatment of all and to uncover and confront white supremacy, the system which facilitates the preferences, privileges, and power of white people at the expense of non-white people and pits racial and ethnic groups against each other by upholding a hierarchy based on proximity to whiteness. Our goal is to identify and expose the political, economical, and cultural systems which have enabled white supremacy to flourish and to create new structures and policies which will ensure equity and inclusion for all. In our commitment to uncovering the blight of white supremacy on our humanity, we take responsibility to address it and to eliminate it in all its forms through intentional actions, starting with ourselves and our communities. Thank you.
Shirley, will you introduce our speaker?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And again, welcome to the Not in Our Town Princeton Continuing Conversations. I'm honored to have been asked to introduce tonight's speaker. This is an evening to listen carefully and take heed. On March 10th, 1836, 90 of the 131 slaves who worshiped in the gallery of the First Presbyterian Church of Princeton, now Nassau Presbyterian Church, were dismissed. As many settled in what is now the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, they started a church of their own, the First Presbyterian of Color of Princeton. The church became the spiritual home of these formerly enslaved members, located in what is the historic African-American community. The church became what is now the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, where the Reverend Lukata Mjumbe serves as pastor. It is from this church platform that Reverend Junebaye teaches, preaches, and ministers to an expanding community in a diversity of ways. He has struggled against urban conflict and destruction and police violence, structural poverty, and the community erosion of gentrification. He is a co-founder of the Black Alliance for Peace and a member of the Board of Trustees of Princeton Community Housing. Reverend Junebaye is an advocate for racial and environmental justice, the protection of immigrants, cooperative economics, and the development of public policy strategies to abolish the system of mass incarceration. He actively seeks to explore and challenge the intersection of multiple forms of oppression. As a spiritual and community leader, he is called to bring together people of diverse traditions who are deeply committed to freedom and justice. Reverend Junebaye graduated with the highest honors from both the Morehouse College of Political Science and the Princeton Theological Seminary, where he received his Master of Divinity degree and Master of Theology, Religion, and Society programs. This continuing conversation session is not one where you can sit back, relax, and hope to be entertained. This evening, a veteran grassroots community organizer, public policy advocate, interfaith leader, and dynamic community pastor will present the raw history of Black Princeton, from racism in the Witherspoon-Jackson community to the history of academic life for Black students at Princeton Theological Seminary. If we all truly hear Reverend Junebaye's message, our conversation should be more than continuing. We must address and strive for reconciliation and right relationships here in Princeton and beyond. At this time, I proudly present Not in Our Town Princeton speaker, Reverend Lukata Mjumbe.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Shirley.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it is a blessing to be introduced by you. You inspire me as you inspire so many others. And I'm going to talk about you a bit tonight and some of your work. Thank you to the Not in Our Town organization, and thank you to all of you who are joining us on Zoom in this call, those who might be watching over the Not in Our Town YouTube page, and however else it may be live streamed or recorded or shared later. I'm thankful for the privilege and the opportunity to be able to speak with you, to speak to you, and to think and to discuss and to have conversation about where we are, where we've been, where we go from here. I'm thankful to be back. I was with the Not in Our Town organization back in May of last year towards the beginning of this global pandemic, and I talked about sheltering in the place of privilege and reflected upon how the community of Princeton dealt with the realities of the Spanish flu back in 1918. And unfortunately, we continue to see many of the lessons, some apparently unlearned, still at play as we struggle with COVID-19. But I'm thankful to be back here with you on this particular day, the first day of Black History Month, formerly Black History Week. I have often said that it is always an irony here. It's the shortest and the coldest month of the year. When I look out my window, now the snowiest day of the year. But we're going to pack as much information and dialogue and discussion as we can, as well as inspiration into the time that we have together. But I want to begin with a confession. When I first learned of the Not in Our Town organization, I was a little bit cautious, curious, and even skeptical, because prior to coming to New Jersey, prior to even becoming a pastor, I was an environmental justice community organizer. And there's this phenomenon that we frequently came up against as those who were organizing for racial justice and health justice in communities of color and in poor communities. And it was called NIMBY. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, the not in my backyard phenomenon. And this was a problem. NIMBY was something that was put forward by normally privileged, wealthy, white communities that said there will not be hazardous waste facilities, there will not be pollution in my backyard. And in effect, what they did was pushed it out of their backyard and made sure that there were no hazardous waste facilities sited in their communities, but they pushed them into Black and brown and poor communities. So when I heard not in our town, I was like, oh, here we go again. We have this idea of pushing away certain things into other communities. And when I began to look at the mission statement and I began to get to know people like Linda Oppenheim and to learn of the work of this organization, I was inspired that this was different, that this was not the same. Nevertheless, I'm going to push us today to say, yes, not in our town, but perhaps we might need to say not in our town again, or not in our town anymore, because if we are honest and we confront the lies that we need to confront during this first night and throughout Black History Month, and let me just say, coldest short of the month of the year, Black history is not something that should only be remembered, observed, studied, celebrated during the month of February. It needs to be done 12 months out of the year. I'll send a shout out to my wife, has her own nonprofit organization, Museums in Motion, that does Black History Month exhibits 12 months out of the year. This is something that we need to be committed to studying, to learning, to uncovering, and confronting as we move forward together. So tonight, as a part of our continuing conversation, I'm going to seek to faithfully examine and confront some of the critical dimensions of the often disappeared, distorted, and even dishonest representations of some of the histories and the realities of Black Princeton and Black lives. Clearly, in 20 to 30 minutes, I don't have time to do all of the history of Black Princeton. Clearly, if you just go on Shirley Satterfield's tour over and over and over again, that still won't be enough time for you to get the fullness and the completeness of what it is that we need to discuss, because there is a long history of Black people in Princeton going back hundreds of years. And I would encourage some of us to look at some of the text, some of the reports, as you continue in your study. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen and share some images with you in the first part of this presentation as we go through, so you can see as well as hear. So we begin with confronting the lies. Confronting the lies that we tell ourselves and others. Oftentimes in Black History Month, we deal with truth, supposedly, but we don't deal with the lies that often hide the truth. We emphasize Black facts. We emphasize Black celebration. We emphasize Black accomplishment and certain Black history figures, but we don't always take the time to see the lies that we need to confront and that we must confront if we are to deal with our history honestly and completely, and to ensure that our history is not a mystery. Now, I'm going to, as I said before, encourage you to go and do some of your own research. There's a lot of information out there, though not enough, I'll say. I'm waiting for Shirley's book. There's a lot of information that has been published. There's the Princeton Seminary Historical Audit. There is the Princeton and Slavery Project report, which is phenomenal in my view in terms of the kinds of information that you can not only discover, but you can be pointed to. I hear my people singing The Voices of the African American Princeton Community by Catherine Watterson, Princeton Seminary by James Moorhead, who was a professor at the seminary when I was there. These are all important texts, and there are many others. And we can share others, and maybe you'll discuss more in our breakout rooms, because we're going to have opportunity to have information presented. There will be time for you to ask questions, for me to try to come up with some answers that answer and solutions that solve, but then you'll go into breakout groups. and be able to have more intense conversations, and perhaps you can share more information there. But we must confront the lies because truth is important. Now, I'm a pastor and a preacher, and I'm going to have to at least have one Bible verse here tonight. And the Gospel of John chapter 8 verse 32 says, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." The condition upon truth being liberatory and setting us free is that we have to know it. And I submit to you tonight that if we are to know the truth about Black Princeton, if we are to know the truth about what has happened and what is happening in our communities, that we have to confront some of the lies which cover it, some of the lies which omit the truth, some of the lies which disconnect the truth. And so I want to deal with just a second about, what's a lie? To lie in the traditional classical sense of the definition is to make a believed false statement to another person with the intention that the other person believe that statement to be true. And there's some problems with this traditional definition of lie. Sometimes the lie that we tell, or the lie that we tell to ourselves or one another, is a lie of omission. It's not a believed false statement that we make. It's the statement that we omit. It's the truth that we do not tell. It's the revelation that is not revealed. And so when we look at the history of Black Princeton, we'll see some interesting things happening. You'll have some truth, and it'll conceal a lie. You'll have a lie, and it will conceal some truth. You'll have bits and pieces of truth that are scattered here and there, but they're not always connected to one another, so you can see the full and complete truth that needs to be revealed. So the lies that I'm going to confront today are not simply things that are said about Black Princeton, about Black people, about the Witherspoon-Jackson community, about the legacy of privilege and promise and prosperity and progressiveness that is Princeton, New Jersey. But I'm also going to talk about some things that are left out, some things that get left in the shadow or remain concealed, and that what we oftentimes have, and this quote has been attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte. I've heard it attributed to W.E.B. Du Bois, but it's a statement about history, that history is a lie agreed upon. That history oftentimes is a set of untruths, half-truths, distorted truths, concealed truths, omitted truths, lies that people, whether they be consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously, have agreed to accept as the truth. And so today I'm going to seek to confront some of those lies that I believe that we have agreed to as a part of our history, and I have been inspired. I came to Princeton, New Jersey back in 2010. I came as a seminarian at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I was blessed to be able to do my Master's of Divinity and Theology degrees there. I was blessed to be able to take courses at the university during my time at the seminary, and I was also blessed to come in contact with community historians like Shirley Satterfield, and I remember going on the Black Princeton tour, and as I listened closely, and as I watched, and as I studied and followed up, I began to find some things that were very interesting, that as much truth that was being shared, there was also some things that were, or that seemed to be curiously untruthful. I remember walking through the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood and the historic African-American community, the historic Black community, and I walked alongside Shirley, who told us about the history and the businesses that were once there and the homes that were once filled by Black families. But I looked around and I didn't see the Black families coming out of the black homes. I didn't see the black businesses anymore that were once there. When I began to study and to try to discover the way forward, I found that we have some challenges. We have some struggles. We have some work to do that it's perhaps more difficult than we imagine it to be, and that it does not help us to pretend as if this struggle does not require intensive labor. And so I was inspired by Shirley, but I was also inspired even more recently by the work of Eddie Glaude as he reflected upon the work of James Baldwin. So these are my inspirations for tonight. The Dr. Eddie Glaude from Princeton University, who looked at the work of James Baldwin and talked about the importance of confronting the lie. In his book, Begin Again, Dr. Glaude said that we are at a moment perhaps when we have the opportunity once again to begin again to make some critical changes in the life of this country in our struggle against racism and white supremacy. But before we are able to do that, we have to begin with the confronting of the lie that we tell to ourselves that America is better than it actually is. That America is actually more evolved than it actually is. And that as long as we continue to make excuses for our country, as long as we refuse to see our country in its fullness with all of its contradictions, James Baldwin said, I love this country more than any other, and so I reserve the right to criticize it. He also said that I cannot believe what it is you say when I see what it is that you do. And just as Baldwin talked about America, and just as Eddie Glaude helped us to see how we have to be truthful even when we look at our country today and not pretend that what we see or what we saw in the Trump administration or what we saw on January 6th is somehow an aberration or so far removed from the cultural and political realities of this country, that I say that we have to look at Princeton. We have to look at it honestly and openly and confront the lies. So I'm going to talk a little bit from a narrow perspective. I'm going to talk about the Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm going to talk about the university and the university students. I'm going to talk about how it impacted and came into relationship with the historic black community that is the Witherspoon-Jackson community, which contained a peasant class of workers, of black people. And I want to begin with Theodore Sedgwick Wright. I hope you know Theodore Sedgwick Wright. Theodore Sedgwick Wright graduated from Princeton Seminary in 1828. He came in 1825. And this great celebration during Black History Month, I remember every February at Black History Month, we would talk about Theodore Wright, how he was admitted to the seminary in 1825, how he was the first black man to graduate from any seminary in the United States here in Princeton at Princeton Seminary. And we were all proud to stand in that legacy. But we also came to understand something else about Theodore Wright when we confronted the lies, when we dug a little deeper, that though indeed Theodore Wright was the first African American, the first black man, the first Negro to graduate from a seminary in the United States, that Theodore Sedgwick Wright was not allowed to live on campus. Theodore Sedgwick Wright was not allowed to actually eat on campus. In fact, Theodore Sedgwick Wright, after graduating, years later came back for some commencement services of the university that were being held in the seminary chapel in Miller Chapel, and he was brutally assaulted by a student, a Southern student named Thomas Ancrum from Camden, South Carolina, because he saw this black man sitting in the back of the chapel while other whites were standing, and it was unacceptable to him. We recently commemorated this back in last year in September of 2020, the anniversary of the beating of Theodore Sedgwick Wright, the first African American that ever graduated from any seminary. But there's something that goes even further. There's an acknowledgement of that. There's an acknowledgement sometimes when you ask the question, when you dig a little deeper. But when we dig even deeper than deep, we find that in 1835 there was something else that happened. The year before, in September of 1835, that same student, Thomas Ancrum from Camden, South Carolina, who was in the class of 1838 at Princeton University, along with another student named Hilliard Judge, who was in the class of 1837, they noticed that there was a white man that had gone into a house in the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood. And they suspected that he might be an abolitionist, that he might be there to stir up the good colored people that were down there at the end of what they called Guinea or Nigger Lane, now known as Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. And they looked and they saw that, and then they decided that they were going to take action, and they went back on campus. They convened a meeting, they took a vote, according to some form of parliamentary procedure, it suggested, and voted and decided that they would go and lynch the abolitionists that had gone into the black home. The black home that he went into was located at 110 Witherspoon Street. We're going to look at that house in just a minute here. But as many as 1/3 of the student population, and you see a clip from an article from the Princeton Whig that gave an account, and this story was publicized in newspapers all around the country. A group of 60 students marched down, I'll call it Witherspoon Street, and marched down to 110 Witherspoon Street. They confronted the black man who answered the door, the homeowner, which possibly was Isaac Stockton, one of the founders of Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, or the first Presbyterian, the first colored Presbyterian Church of Princeton. That they confronted him. He at first denied that there was any white man in the house, but then they convinced him and pulled this man out of the house. They threatened to lynch him. They threatened to kill him. And again, we have to know that lynching is not simply hanging from a tree. Lynching can be tarring and feathering and beating. There's all different kinds of torture and murderous intent, which can be associated with lynching. That lynching is designed to take one's life, to take one's dignity, and to terrorize others. But they pulled him out of the house. They threatened to take his life. He begged for his life. He said he had a wife and children. His name was Amos Phelps. You can go and look him up in the Princeton and Slavery Report. And ultimately, they decided that they would not kill him, not lynch him. They simply would run him out of town after they burned his papers and his newspapers and all of his abolitionist materials. And they would run him out of town, run him out of Princeton, and make him agree to never return again. Now, one of the interesting things is here, and you see this house here. This is 110, what is now 110 Witherspoon Street. It had a different address then, but this is the house that this abolitionist was pulled out of. This is the house today, which is known as the Paul Robeson House of Princeton. This is a house which has a long history and a legacy as a part of the Witherspoon-Jackson community. We're going to talk a little more about that. But what I want you to know, and one of the lies that we have to deal with and we have to confront, is not only was there an attempted lynching, but when you read some of the letters that describe what is happening, there was even what they said was a red-headed black man or a red-headed Negro that was also in the middle of the lynch mob, encouraging the lynching of Amos Phelps to occur. That going all the way back then, we had some good white people, like the abolitionists, like the seminarian who is said to have invited the abolitionists to come into town. And we also had some Thomas Ancrums and some Hilliard Judges. We had some red-headed Negroes that were encouraging the lynching going all the way back to 1835. Now, I said that the attempted lynching was in September 1835. The attack by Thomas Ancrum was in September 1836. And in between that is what Shirley Satterfield mentioned earlier, was the dismissal of the 90 members, of the 131 members from the first Presbyterian Church of Princeton that later went on to form what was called and what is called today Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. You see the date October the 11th, 1840, because that is the formal date. That is the formal date where we celebrate our anniversary. We celebrated last year, and we're in the midst of celebrating our 180th year this year. But in between, there was an attempted lynching at the front end, and there was an attack on Theodore Cedric Wright on the back end. You see an image of Betsy Stockton, one of our mothers of our church, one of our founding members of our church. We have a great legacy, a great history. We're proud of where we've been. We're proud of what we've gone through and what we've made it through and what we've made it to. But we must realize that there have been real struggle in this town. Today, I remember when I came to Princeton, it was almost a mythical place. Everything was wonderful, so they said. There was progress. Black and white people got along. There was privilege. There were prominent people. We talked about the wonderful people who graduated from the seminary, from the university. We learned of Toni Morrison, Cornel West, and Michael Eric Dyson, and Nell Painter, and so many others who have done phenomenal work through the university and through this community. But concealed beneath some of what was on top was the underbelly of violence, was the threat of violence, was the reality of violence. This is something that we've seen throughout the history. I don't know if we know about the attack of this man. And I'm not going to, I would encourage you to go to the Princeton University report to read more about this person who was said to be responsible for the Princeton race riot of 1846, initially attacking a black woman and assaulting a black woman. And when that black woman was defended, organizing a larger group of people. But there is a long history of violence. And let me just say, it's not just in terms of physical violence. I want to submit to you today that if we really want to begin to explore and discover the history of Princeton, we have to know that even in the midst of celebration, even in the midst of the accomplishment, we have to confront an underlying lie that may be within. We talked about Theodore Cedric Wright being the first African-American to graduate from Princeton Seminary. Well, Matthew Anderson, who entered Princeton Seminary in 1874, was the first black student that was allowed to live on the seminary campus. Yeah. But he was allowed to live on the seminary campus because they had not realized that they had extended this invitation to flattering inducements to a black student. And when they discovered that he was a black student, they put him in a lumber closet. Mm-hmm. They put him in a lumber closet. They did not allow him to stay in one of the rooms until one of the other white students said, wait a minute, there's a vacant room next to me. You should be able to come and live there. And so he fought and he struggled, and he was ultimately able to live and be the first student to live black student to live in Alexander Hall, to live on campus, but he still was not allowed to eat there. He still was not allowed to share meals, to break bread with his sister and brother seminarians. And so where do you think that he had to go for his food?
Witherspoon-Jackson community.
Amen. He went to the Witherspoon-Jackson community. In fact, he went to 110 Witherspoon Street. Again, that probably wasn't the address then, but he went to that same house where there had been an attempted lynching in 1835. He went to that same house that later had been sold to John Anthony Simmons, who was a prominent businessman, who was a trustee at Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, who owned an oyster bar, who owned a wash house, who owned many different properties, and one of the greatest contributors and givers to Witherspoon Street. He went to that house because he said, because the seminary said, we're not going to allow you to eat with us, but you go to the Witherspoon-Jackson community, and they took their meals, not only Matthew Anderson, but also some of his classmates who had also come there around the same time. You had a Francis J. Grimke, you had a Hugh Brown, you had a Brother Phelps, you had others who were there, and they went to this house. There it is again. And that's where they were required to take their meals. And the Witherspoon-Jackson community subsidized Princeton Theological Seminary for decades and decades and decades, as they had already been doing back when Theodore Cedric Wright, not allowed to eat, not allowed to live on campus, and lived with what was said in the records. He lived in Miss Scudder's house. Also, one of the prominent families of the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, the Black community had to take care of the Black seminarians. The Black community had to take care of students that came through the university. The Black community stood together, and we find a great representation of that in the legacy of the Robeson family. And I want to say Robeson family because I found that many people like to talk about Paul Robeson, who was incredibly important, a scholar, an activist, an advocate, an entertainer, a singer. He was phenomenal on so many different levels. He was born in this home in 1898, but we don't always know about his mother and his father. His father, Reverend William Drew Robeson, who served as the pastor of Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church and lived in this home, and he pastored Witherspoon from 1898 to 1901. I started thinking about Reverend Robeson just last week once again. Last week, January 27th, was my 2-year anniversary as the pastor of Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. And I was installed on January 27th, 2019, which was the 118-year anniversary of William Drew Robeson's last sermon at Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. And the reason why he had to preach his last sermon on that day was because there was another kind of lynching which had occurred. There was what we might call an ecclesiastical lynching, because William Drew Robeson was one who stood up against lynchings and made appeals to President McKinley about anti-lynching legislation, because William Drew Robeson was one who stood up for people within the Black community, because William Drew Robeson, who lived in this house, had the audacity to go to Woodrow Wilson when he was the president of Princeton University and say to him that his older son, Paul's older brother, should have a right to attend Princeton University, only to have Woodrow Wilson, the president of Princeton University at the time, and supposedly a good Presbyterian, to say we have no coloreds at Princeton University. And when William Drew Robeson refused to accept that as an acceptable answer from the university, from a Presbyterian, from a Christian, things got bad for William Drew Robeson. And there was a grand effort and a strategy and a conspiracy to remove him from the pulpit and to end his time and tenure as the pastor of Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. There's a long history connected to our communities. Some of it is wonderful. Some of it is a source of celebration. We can talk about so much, and we need to continue to do this 12 months out of the year. But I submit to you that we have to step back and recognize that when we just talk about the past, when we just talk about what came before, when we just reflect upon the history, we have denied our responsibility to know the truth and have the truth to make us free. You know, I celebrate my sister, my deacon, Shirley Satterfield, and the work that has been done. Hopefully some of you all have seen the historic markers that have been placed at the historic Black churches in the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, at Mount Pisgah AME, at Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, at First Baptist of Princeton and Morning Star Church of God in Christ. Hopefully you've seen those markers, because they remind us of where we've been. They remind us of what we've gone through. They remind us of the struggle and the journey, because the community came together and we built businesses and we built communities and we took care of each other and we stood up in the face of violence and pressure year after year, generation after generation. But I must submit to you as I close here that our memories and that our historical markers are seeds. They're seeds. And one of the things I want you to think about is, what is a seed and where does a seed come from? A seed is something that is produced by a plant that was once vibrant and abundant. When we save a seed, we have a living legacy of what once was, but that plant, that fruit, that abundant harvest that we had before is no more. It has passed, it has transitioned, it has died, it is behind us. And a seed that we simply hold in our hands, or that we simply place as a marker, and that is not planted within rich soil, and that is not watered, and that is not cared for, and is not given access to adequate sunlight, it is a seed that will never grow, a seed that will never become, a seed that will never be what it is supposed to be. And I say to everyone, however many people we have now who are watching and listening on this call, that we have to do the work of cultivating and enriching the soil, that we have to do the work of making sure that the seeds are adequately watered and receive the sunlight that they need, that we have to do the work that the weeds of ecclesiastical lynchings or economic violence or gentrification have to be pulled out, and that is your responsibility.
So I'm actually in the middle.
That is your responsibility. Because it is unacceptable for not in our town to simply come together and to hear Black people or other people of color to talk about the realities of racism and white supremacy and how we must struggle and talk about what we've been through and talk about what we survived. We have a responsibility together to plant the seed, to cultivate the soil, to make sure that it receives the sunlight and the water that is needed. There's another scripture where the Apostle Paul says that I planted, Apollos watered, but God provided the increase. It says that not one person can do it all. It requires partnership. It requires something greater than us as individuals. And I call upon the Not in Our Town organization to say, not in our town anymore. Not in our town again. And we will not simply just look back and see what we've went through. We will not simply try to say, well, it's just the Trump people. It's just the people who would attack a Capitol. It's not here in Princeton. Yes, it is, as long as we do not build, cultivate, nurture, encourage, and grow. Because there's a lie that we have to confront when we look at this history. And this is my sister, and they were unveiling these markers, and they are wonderful and beautiful. And there's more that are coming. And Shirley was telling me about how the plans are being set up for the other markers. And what I want to say to everyone else who loves Shirley, everyone else who loves this work and has a commitment to this work, let us begin to cultivate the soil and nurture and enrich the soil so that when the seeds are planted, that we can actually grow something more than what we have, than what we've been. The preservation of our Black history is essential, but it's more than Black facts and Black celebrations and looking back behind us. We have to ask ourselves, where are those Black businesses today? All the ones that we're going to mark. And there's an answer to that. And Black people have to take some responsibility for that. When Black people have the opportunity to go up on Nassau Street, when Black people have the opportunity to go and shop with white people, when Black people have the opportunity to give their money away, they did, and our businesses collapsed and failed and died on the vine. We have to take some responsibility too for building our businesses, building our communities, bringing back our people. I have to say to you that it is unacceptable for us not to have a plan for how we can bring back some of our families into the Witherspoon-Jackson community. And the plan is not to see who we can get who can afford a $500,000 or $700,000 home. We have to look at cooperative economic strategies, cooperative housing. They have co-op housing in New York. They have co-op housing in DC. There are co-op models all around the country. There are answers that answer and solutions that solve, that can help us to rebuild our communities, our power, our future. I love Black History Month, but I'm advocating for Black Future Month. I'm advocating that we go beyond where it is that we have been, and that we do something more and something greater. And I do have hope. I hope you all know who this young man is, Nicholas Johnson, who is the first Black valedictorian at Princeton University. But most of us never got a chance to see him or talk to him or go to the celebration because it was during COVID-19 in 2020. So we didn't get a chance to celebrate the way we wanted to celebrate. But this brother is from Montreal, Canada. And we need to build up this community right here. We have always supported our university students. We have always supported our seminary students. But it's important that we together decide that we are going to build, that we are going to grow, that we are going to do more than what it is that we have done. We have to confront the lies. Princeton is a beautiful place. I've grown to love it more and more every year that I've been here, since 2010. But we have some challenges. We have some work to do. We have some hidden histories. Gentrification is violence. What it is that we do with the exploitation of the peasant working class of Guatemalans in the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood today is violence. They have not received one relief check. They have not received any emergency support that has come from the government. That is violence. And slavery was violent not just when you got lashed with the whip or hung from a tree. The institution itself was violence, and the economic violence of today and the economic violence which has pushed people out of their homes and into other places is something that we have to confront today. So I put forward this challenge to you. At this first day of Black History Month, let's begin to build a Black Future Month, a Black Future Year, a Black Future Decade, a Black Future Century. Let us begin to organize together, to come together, confronting the lies that we tell ourselves and that we tell one another, because there is still work to be done. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Reverend Lukata. I feel like I just want to give space for people to sort of what you've said. Yeah. Reverend Lukata has agreed to take a few questions. Because there's so many people here with us tonight, I would ask that you either raise your hand or put your question in the chat. There is no way that we're going to be able to get to all of the questions, but just bear with us. We already have somebody that's identified in our participants as iPhone. I'm asking you to unmute now if you'd like to ask your question. Could you speak a little louder, please?
I'm not hearing.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Would you be willing to put your question in the chat, please? And if anybody else has a question, if they could put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we couldn't hear you. Kip Cherry looks like she's about to ask a question.
Sure, I was going to put it in the chat. My question to Lukata, he mentioned bringing people maybe who've left the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood back. But I would also like to see people moving into all neighborhoods in Princeton. And in fact, my own neighborhood, which is the Dempsey, Walnut Lane, Cuyler area, part of Dempsey Avenue was extended specifically to solicit homeowners that were mixed race.
Mhm.
And there were several Black families that moved into that part of Dempsey Avenue. But over the years, unfortunately, they've left. I think there's only one family there now that is African American, and other races have moved into the neighborhood, which has been wonderful. But I think the neighborhood has lost a lot by not having more African American families, and I'd like to see them return to Dempsey Avenue as well.
I agree. And there's one more family that moved in about 2 years ago. That's mine. I live on Walnut Avenue, and so our family is here in this area. And but absolutely, it's not simply about the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood in particular, but it's about populating and opening up spaces throughout Princeton. It's about looking at it comprehensively, even looking where African Americans are today, because they live in other places in supposedly affordable housing communities in other parts of the city. And so we have to do the work. And I appreciate some of the work that some who are connected to this organization have done to really begin to do some needs assessments and to figure out a strategy for opening up space and bringing mixed income families to be able to live within our community and to enjoy all the blessings that are here. I also want to be very specific that requires investment. That requires real work. And again, it's not, I know that some of us are connected to organizations and institutions, but let me just say very clearly that when I'm talking about these things, it's about sweat equity. It's about blood, sweat, tears, but it's also about real equity. It's also about money. And when I look at the Paul Robeson House of Princeton, for example, that house that we pointed to that's located at 110 Witherspoon Street, that's next door to my office, and I see the long legacy of work and effort and more recent legacy of struggle to try to restore it and to rebuild it into a center that can help to facilitate transformation within our community. It is unacceptable to me that we are doing small $10,000 fundraisers. I am calling, and I will do it publicly. I've done it privately. The university needs to take responsibility. The seminary needs to take responsibility. This community subsidized the seminary's housing program and food program for a century. This was a place where their students had the only recorded student-led lynch mob in the history of the United States. There's some responsibility there. Woodrow Wilson facilitated the ecclesiastical lynching of Reverend William Drew Robeson. It's unacceptable to celebrate Paul Robeson and not talk about what you did to his father, and then not talked about when they were pushed out of that house and around the corner onto Green Street, how Paul Robeson's mother died as a result of having her clothes catch on fire and dying from her wounds. There's some lies underneath some of the truth that we tell. Yes, we love Paul Robeson, but what'd you do to his daddy? What'd you do to his mother? What'd you do to his community? What did we do? And all of us have responsibility, because there were Black people who have always worked in league and in partnership, like the redheaded Negro that called for the lynching out in front of the house. And so we have to look together to see what is a comprehensive plan that brings about blood, sweat, tears, and finances and resources so that we can do the things that we need to do. And we need your help to begin to call upon our leadership, to call upon our communities to say, you know what, we're going to enrich this soil. You know, some of you who are gardeners know that, it's compost is waste and mess and stuff that doesn't smell too good when it goes into the compost bin, but over time, you're able to build it up and you're able to create something that you can then add as an amendment to the soil that will make it healthy and strong where something can grow. And that is our responsibility, to take some of the compostable material from our past and put it in our soil today so that we can build for the future. And I'm sorry, I know I need to be looking at questions in the chat here.
That's okay. I'm just thinking we're at 7:56 and we try to leave at least half an hour for Linda. How are you feeling? One more question, is that fine? This question doesn't count as the one more question, but we've been asked who's standing behind you.
Oh, well, I mean, I got to do it the right way. This is Paul Robeson. This is Paul Robeson. This is a scene from the film Emperor Jones. Paul Robeson was one, as before I became a pastor, his activism and his advocacy as someone who struggled for peace, as someone who used his gifts and his talents, he was an inspiration to me even before I learned about his father. So I came to Princeton loving Paul, but once I arrived here, I learned about William Drew and Maria Bustillo. And so this is Paul Robeson behind me. You also got Dr. King shooting pool, and I think we got Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Morpheus from The Matrix. So
Hi, Kim. It's Fern.
Hi, Fern. So
I'd love to
Fern's
say
back,
something
and
real quick.
Yep, please.
Okay. Thank you. My grandparents were born here. My grandmother was born here in 1887. Her on my mother's side, my father's side, my mother's side goes 2 generations back. My grandchildren make 6 generations. The thing is that you're saying that is so poignant, that really hurts me to my heart, that do not know. We were not told about our history. We were not told. I remember in '63 when King went to march, and my mother, we lived on Hanover Street in Trenton. She's from Princeton. Not doing it because she said they're going to kill you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I want you to know is what we were taught, and they didn't give us a lot of history. I didn't know about King when he was killed. Okay, I was in school. It was a riot that broke out, and it was like, who is King? And I had a white teacher that took us aside and told us who King was. He said, but don't tell anybody I told you. And he was fired the next day.
My Lord.
Okay, so I'm just telling you, the lies are told, but dang, we have not really told the truth, nothing but truth. So God, the only thing I could do with my daughters to try to bring things up is put braids in their hair, beads in their hair, growing up in West Windsor, being tired of people grabbing their hair. How often do you comb it? How often do you wash it? You know, we have a lot to do with what we have to do. You know, with teaching who we are, what we are. And our kids, although my children, thank God, when we put down, what's your race? Black. What's your race? Black. What's your race? Black. We're not African American. And I do love when Smokey Robinson did, who came up with, who sat around and decided we were colored, we were Negroes, we were all kinds of things. I'm Black. If you're white, I'm Black. It's that simple. And thank you, Reverend, for allowing me to speak.
Thank you. Can we take maybe a couple more questions? Is that possible?
Yes, there's been a lot of chat in the chat to say, can we take more questions? So I'm going to try and scroll back up to Surya A. Baliga would like to know if there's any historical event of police brutality in Princeton that you'd be willing to talk about.
Sure. I mean, I think that, well, and let me use this as an opportunity to go all the way up to modern times. And I would encourage people to talk to residents of the peasant working class community that lives in Witherspoon-Jackson today. Because when I have conversations with my brown brothers and sisters that live in the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, and I talk to them about what their experience is, then they experience the reality of police abuse, the reality of violence as a matter of course. And it's something that, as much as we may imagine, oh well, this only happens in Trenton. This only happens in other parts of not in our town. It doesn't happen. Oh, indeed it does. Indeed it does. But it's quieted. It's secreted. You know, we have homeless people who live in Princeton. And I've had
Absolutely.
people who are homeless in Princeton who have come to me and talked to me about harassment and abuse. Some recently who have said, I've decided that I have to move out of Princeton and be homeless somewhere else because there's too much police abuse. You know, we had instances of being warned when I first came to Princeton Seminary, and I think I saw a question in the chat that we were warned, make sure that you don't drive and make a wrong turn on Nassau Street or somewhere else if you're a black student coming to Princeton Seminary. We had incidents that dealt with campus security, and there are many different layers of law enforcement that we have within Princeton. But let me say this, the only way that we can really know the nature of the problem as well as the nature of the solution is we have to engage and connect with one another the way we have been doing here. And I see we have 200 people plus here. You know, we had a Princeton Civil Rights Commission meeting back in September of last year, and Reverend Karen Hernandez-Granson worked with me closely on that, and Tommy Parker and other people, where we said we have to have this in Spanish and English. Because the reality is, some of the people who you need to hear from, who we need to hear from, we will not hear from if everything we do is in English. Now, I've learned recently that you can do Zoom and you can have closed captioning across the screens, and I'm trying to do my research to figure out at least how to begin to do that. But we have to recognize that there's a barrier. And if you look at the history, there was a history back a couple of hundred years ago, too. There's this great story in the Princeton and Slavery Report where it talks about a white woman who came from the South, and they urged her not to go down into the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood because it was safe, because you didn't know what would happen to you. They're not going to talk to you. And she was a liberated Southern white woman, and she said, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to look and listen and talk. And she went house by house, Shirley. She started going up Green Street and went to every single house and documented how many books they had and if they had pen and paper, and talked about how amazing these people were, contrary to everything that she had been told up the hill. And so that was one of the first things that I did when I became pastor at Witherspoon Street. I went house to house. I went door to door. Some of you, I went to your houses. You remember when I knocked on your door. And
I wish you came to mine. I really do.
Remember that.
I do. I wish you came to mine because I am deep in history, but at the same time, you have to understand that this history is just so overwhelming. I had to read I hear my people singing 4 times, and it's giving me nightmares because it hurt me, because at one hand they say, I love my Princeton. On the other hand, they say they treated me like crap.
Yep.
Well,
I love my Princeton. My Princeton doesn't always love me.
Absolutely. And it's same here, so, but we are Princetonians, and we're supposed to make a difference.
Amen.
And we were brought here to make a difference. You were brought here to make a difference. I was born here to make a difference. Okay. So that's what we do.
What is there? Kim, is there another question?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Fern. I wanted to also say that Karen Hernandez-Granson says, muchísimas gracias for everything you do for the Latinx community. I think you answered. Bob Weber asks, what are the best ways through deeds and actions to bring justice to the community?
As a community organizer, I have to retreat and revert to my standard answer. Ask the people; they'll tell you. I do not have all of the answers that answer and the solutions that solve. I do know that the process of discovery begins with full and complete engagement and listening. That we have to recognize that we're not only looking back, but we're looking forward, and we're looking at right now. And we have to pay attention to what's happening right now and know that it's complicated. It's
Yes.
complicated. It's not simple. It's not a one-shot solution. And it's not a one group that's going to be able to do it. There's some things that the Latinx community needs to do themselves. And I've been happy to be organizing with them and working around wage theft issues and other issues. You know, there's some things that the Black community needs to do themselves. The Black community needs to come together, and we need to be talking to and with one another. The white community needs to do the same thing, and we all need to be intersecting and having these conversations, and we need to plan and we need to work, and we need to know that we didn't get this way in 1 year or in 5 years, so a 5-year plan is not going to fix it. It's going to have to be a continuing process of growth and development and strategy and partnership. And so I don't have every answer, but I do know, as I've talked to my friends like Ben Colbert, who longtime member of the Princeton Community Housing Organization that I now am blessed to be able to serve with, that we have to make space and create room for all kinds of people to be able to participate in this development. I don't know about you, but if I had to have $500,000 to be able to move into Princeton or be able to afford a $500,000 home, I would not be able to be here. I would not be able to be here if I wasn't a pastor of a church and living in the church's house. You know, you can't live in Princeton if you make $40,000, $50,000 and you have a family. And that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable for you only to make space for an exploited group of people. That's the history of Princeton. Designate Witherspoon-Jackson. I talked about this when I did the sheltering in place of privilege. Designate this area as your peasant neighborhood, where you will super exploit their labor, and that's where you will allow them to live. And so that's what Kip is saying. They need to be able to live all over Princeton, because let's be honest. The reason why Princeton has the wealth that it has, whether it be the university, whether it be the seminary, whether it be this community, it's because poor people were super exploited for their labor and they built it. Princeton never could have made it had it not had the Black working class in the Witherspoon-Jackson community. Never could have made it. Princeton would fall apart right now if it were not for the essential Guatemalan workers that go to work every single day. I had someone who delivered something to me from Amazon today. I said, "Why in the world are you all out here in the snow?" And the woman said, "Oh, well, we volunteered to come in." "Well, we get paid." "Well, we kind of had to. We needed to." You know, she said it all in 2 sentences. And so we have to recognize that the wealth that we have here and the privilege that we have here is built upon the labor and the super exploitation of labor of the people. I'm not going to argue the specifics in terms of you telling me whether or not you can find the name of the slave that built Hodge Hall on the seminary campus. I know that this entire community, because if you look at the southern population that once populated the university student campus, you know, I want to know how much wealth does the Thomas Ancrum family have from Camden, South Carolina, that was attacking Theodore Wright in 1836 and leading the lynch mob in 1835? Because that terrorized a community. And it kept people in place, and it let them know that if you speak up, if you speak out, if you seek to organize, if you try to connect with white abolitionists and people who were struggling for your freedom, that there'll be consequences. And so now that's the legacy that we have now that we have to confront and that we have to address.
Thanks. BJCOL, did you have a question?
Yes. I guess that's me.
That's you, Mr. Colbert.
As just to comment on what a wonderful presentation, and appreciation to Reverend Lukata for mentioning the importance of the Robeson House. If we had not made a decision to try to preserve that facility, it would have been torn down, and we would have lost all of the memories and the histories that Shirley and he talked about today. Witherspoon Church and Paul Robeson House and the neighborhood, the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, are very, very important pieces of history and legacy that must be maintained. And you heard some of that history explained tonight. There is much, much more, and we hope and continue for your support as we move forward.
And I'd like to just give some practical things on that, because I'm seeing some questions about what can we do practically. One, as an organizer, I said we always have to be a part of organizations. So I would encourage you to connect with organizations like, though there are others, but Princeton Mutual Aid is an organization that I have been blessed to have been working with for the last 10 months that are doing phenomenal work in the city of Princeton. They started as a small group of graduate students bucking against the legacy of racism and white supremacy that we often found from the student population at the Princeton University. And in the midst of COVID-19, they began to organize within our community. So Princeton Mutual Aid is an organization I would encourage you to connect with. I would encourage you to connect with Unidad Latina in Acción, New Jersey, which is another grassroots organization that works with day laborers in the Witherspoon-Jackson community and surrounding areas. Again, another organization that I've been blessed to work with in the midst of COVID-19. And had it not been for coronavirus, I likely would not have come into relationship and partnership in the way that I have. I would encourage you to support the Paul Robeson House of Princeton. And again, there's ways that you can support it directly, but I also say, I know that some of you all know people, and you know people that I may not know very well. And this is the thing. We need to go ahead and get this house finished, because we need to do the work right now. We need to continue the legacy of Paul Robeson. We need to continue the legacy of William Drew Robeson. We need to continue the legacy of John Anthony Simmons, who was a leader in the Anti-Slave Society and bought that house in 1847. We need to continue the legacy of Amos Phelps, who was the white abolitionist who was run out of town as a result of being invited by a white seminarian from, I think his name was Philip Gunn, from Princeton Seminary. I mean, this is work that we need to do right now. And again, the Not in Our Town organization, let's add an A. Not in our town again. Not in our town anymore. That what we are going to do is we are going to be very clear that we're not just saying we're going to preserve this sacred space that is the promise and the privilege and the pristine reality of Princeton, but that what we're going to do is we're going to recognize that we have a responsibility to organize and build and be clear. What we do and what we don't do in Princeton also affects what happens and what doesn't happen in Trenton, and what happens and what doesn't happen in Lawrenceville and Ewing and our surrounding communities. And it always has been the case. You know, you see gentrification in Princeton, there's gentrification in Trenton as well, because there's efforts to reclaim and push people out and take some of that territory as well. We had 40 murders in Trenton last year, the highest we've ever had since we've been counting and recording murders in Trenton. 40 murders in a town that has 85,000 people that sits on 8.5 square miles. 40 murders that we had in that community in the midst of a global pandemic. So we have work to do, and I also just want to call for opening up our doors of Princeton. We cannot be this tale of two cities anymore. That the answers that we need, we may also find in area communities and related communities, but let's get organized. You have to join an organization. Individually, you can be impressive, you can say the right words, you can have all the right stands, but it's only when people come together as organizations, as collectives, that we can actually make group change.
Thank you, Rev. Lukata. And also, just so people know, a lot of these organizations are being put into the chat if you wish to connect with them. I have Mary Susan Gregson, who has her hand raised.
You're still on mute.
I was going to ask a question. It's actually Albert who was going to ask, but I actually just want to continue listening. This is really enlightening, and thank you. So I'll hold my question off.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
I mean, a lot of comments thanking you, corroborating what you're saying. Raisa Ruben Stankiewicz asks, how can Princeton focus on the racial injustices and racial history of our community while not isolating itself from / ignoring racial injustice in other neighboring communities in New Jersey?
Well, I think that they're all connected. I mean, and actually, if you really pay attention, there's a lot of people that come from other communities that come to work here. I remember when I was at Princeton Seminary, and they brought in a new company that was providing the meals and the food service at the seminary, Aramark, which I later found out is also a major company that provides meals for prisons, and is a part of the system of mass incarceration in this country. But the workers that were coming to work at the seminary all lived in Ewing and Trenton and other areas, and they were actually told that they weren't allowed to speak to us as students, that they could actually be fired if they actually even had a conversation with us. And so some of if we begin to actually do the racial justice work in Princeton, it will connect us to people in other communities. I think if you even look on the people on this call, there's a lot of people who are on this call that don't live in Princeton, that live in Trenton, that live in Lawrenceville, that live in other places. And so, as much as we may imagine that we're in a bubble, we are actually connected in some essential ways with some other communities. And, when my church, for example, we did we have a mission insight software program where we can plot all of the addresses of our membership, and we can see where they live in relationship to the church. And when we did that, we found that there was, and it wasn't surprising to everyone, but for me, I was very surprised at the significant number of people who were members of our church that do not live in Princeton anymore. They used to, but now they're in Lawrenceville, now they're in Ewing, now they're in Trenton, now they're in Hamilton, now they're in West Windsor, now they're in other areas. Many of them had once lived in Princeton, but now they live in these other communities because you can't afford to live in Princeton anymore. So I think that if we really do the racial justice work in Princeton, principally and authentically, that we will connect with people who are in other communities. And and I will mention that there are other organizations. I'll mention one in Trenton. There's a Trenton Anti-Violence Coalition. It's a group that I meet with every couple of weeks, and we're trying to pull together all the different grassroots organizations that deal with the realities of violence and have resources and programs around violence. And so I've come back to this area again in terms of the center of my ministry in the last couple of years, and so I'm reconnecting with some old partnerships and some new friends. But I think that we have some opportunities, and if I was to scroll through and look at the 6-7 pages that I have on my screen, I know that there's a significant number of people that live. I'm seeing people who live in Ewing, who live in. I see somebody who lives in California on here, who live all around even the country. So if the pandemic hasn't taught us anything, is that location is not as important as we imagined that it was. A year ago, some of us never would have been able to imagine not being at 124 Witherspoon Street every Sunday, because that was the place where we had always been. Shirley has 6 generations in her family connected to Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. We haven't been in the building since March 16th. And yet we've grown as a church. We're more connected as a church. We're doing more ministries now as a church than we did before. So as much as we can see ourselves as being encapsulated by this sense of Princeton, and that's a part of the Princeton seduction. Let me just say that Princeton can be very seductive, to make you imagine. I mean, it happened in the seminary. I saw it very quickly, that this mythical place that we have here, is so different from every other place that there might be, and that if you just go along, you'll catch the Princeton wave and you'll just kind of float with it.
Hmm.
But the reality is, as beautiful, and there's the things I love about Princeton I've never found in any other place of the country, and I've lived all over the country. But underneath, there's a history and a contemporary reality of struggle, of violence, of fear, of discrimination, of privilege, which oppresses other people. There are people in Princeton who are invisibly poor. They drive a beautiful car and it's on E. They live in a beautiful home and they can't afford to pay their mortgage or their light bill. You think they're being, deep by burning their candles, and it's because they have to really cut back on how much electricity that they can actually use in their homes. There are some people who are invisibly poor in Princeton, but they want to have that 08542 or 08540 or whatever other zip codes there are. Are you real Princeton? Do you have that? Do you have the right zip code? I remember somebody asked me that when I first moved. I said, "What are you talking about? What's your zip code?" To see if I actually had the credentials to be where I was. So the struggle continues.
Thank you, Reverend Lukata. It's 8:22. We have a couple more questions. I know that Linda's been answering them. Shall we wrap? Should I ask one of the other questions? I'm looking at Linda Oppenheim. She's.
What does that mean? Does that mean wrap up? Does that mean?
No, it means yes. If you can answer another question, that would be great. People are really hungry for this information and for your inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you. Christine Symington, I'm going to sort of add to her question. What are the ties between the environment and racial justice? And what do you think are the environmental justice issues here in Princeton?
Oh, wow. There are many. I mean, we have an existential crisis when it comes to our environment. And, I've been privileged to be able to organize and march with some of the groups who have organized here. Certainly, we have to one, educate ourselves about the environmental crisis that we are in, not just locally, but globally, that the choices and the decisions that we have made about our planet and the consequences that we are presently experiencing right now. I know that I have enjoyed seeing how Princeton, it seems as if smaller communities, and Kip talked about the neighborhood that we live in and around, are seeking to be in conversation and make decisions about ways to be more environmentally sustainable and better stewards of resources. And there's a wide range of being able to look at that. But what I would encourage us to do is to contrast what is the traditional kind of environmentalist sort of view with what I think was in the question, is the environmental justice. Because environmental justice deals not only with saving the blue whale and the spotted owl and the natural environment, but it recognizes that people actually live within these environments and need to be protected and need to be preserved. And I would say that there is a good deal of environmental assessment work that I submit likely needs to be done in certain communities, such as the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood. And you can see that when you look at the housing stock and you see how some of it is managed and maintained, that the likelihood that there needs to be some assessment work done in some of these areas is real. I don't know who's doing that. I don't know who's talking about that. I don't know who is responsible for conducting those types of assessments. I think that when we look at the environmental justice concerns, we need to look at our children, because we oftentimes see how the environmental justice impacts tend to show up prominently and very quickly in our children. And so, again, is there anything that we're missing in the name that we think that we don't need to look for it in Princeton? I worry about that sometimes because I remember when my children first enrolled, and this wasn't in the Princeton school system, so I get to talk about somebody else. I'll talk about the West Windsor school system because of where we lived on the seminary campus. Our children were in West Windsor. But it was very interesting to me that this is an amazing school. It was a palace in terms of the resources that they had. But because they had so much wealth within the families of this school, in many ways it felt to me that the school had forgotten or never learned how to actually provide support and education for low-income people that didn't have that kind of background. They didn't have the ability to jump on a plane and go and get a weekend course in Paris to help with their French exam on Monday. That didn't have their own private tutors available to them that their parents had the ability to pay for. I mean, I went to the parent teacher meeting. I had to park 2 miles away and to be able to walk to get to the school because parents were so super involved in what was happening with their children. But I saw over and over again the parents that were in low-income housing or had somehow been able to get there because they were seminary students or some other type of strategy that allowed them to be able to be a part of that school, that there were needs that were not being assessed and there were crises that were not being addressed. And so I would again, the answers are always within the people. My community organizer answer is going to kick in every time. And we need to be connecting with the parents of the young people who are in our schools to begin to learn what some of the environmental justice issues might be that we need to be paying attention to. I mean, my background was in lead abatement and a lot of other sorts of things that showed up within children in particular. And so I don't know who's doing that work.
Thank you. I know that Civil Rights Commission and Sustainable Princeton are both interested in carrying that work forward. Do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to offer or any questions that haven't been asked that you would like to answer?
Well, not necessarily. I'll just say thank you again to the Not in Our Town organization, to Linda Oppenheim, to Shirley Satterfield, to Kim Dorman from the Princeton Public Library, for all of you, for the over 200 people who at some point joined here today, and just to say that we have to continue to confront these lies together because we cannot have history be a lie agreed upon. There are some challenges and there are some contradictions that we have within the city of Princeton that we need to address and that we can address together. That I look forward to our continued examination. Please go back and read the texts and the reports that I referenced earlier. I have come up with nothing new here. Everything that I've shared in this Black History Month presentation has been published. And what I found, it used to be something that was used as a form of racial aspersion to Black people. They said, if you want to hide something from Black people, put it in a book. Well, it seems to be now that they've expanded that they put all of the information in these reports, in these audits, and we don't ever read them. Like, I have literally spent weeks pouring through some of the information and I'm just stunned over and over again by what it is that I find in this history. I never would have known that there were race riots in Princeton. I never would have known that there were attempted lynchings in Princeton. I never would have known, even when Woodrow Wilson said there are no colors at the university, there had been Black people who had earned graduate degrees at Princeton University. And one of them, Mr. Abraham, I think, Parker, is that what was his name? Shirley would help me. He went to Lincoln University with William Drew Robeson, and he was the superintendent of the Witherspoon School. And the two of them, William Drew Robeson and the superintendent of the Witherspoon Colored School, they actually advocated together as activists for anti-lynching legislation and making appeals to President McKinley. So there's so much here. I would just ask that you continue to stay connected, that you continue to be involved, that I have discovered that that we can do even more in terms of activism, even sheltering in place, than we could before. Imagine this. If we had this meeting tonight in the Princeton Public Library on February 1st, with the 6 inches of snow that we have out here, there's no way we would have even had the 132 people who are still on the call right now. We would have had a dozen at best we probably would have canceled it, right? It would have been canceled altogether. So, imagine that there are some things that we can do, even in the midst of external circumstances that are challenging. And that is our responsibility. Each generation, and we're this new generation, must, out of relative obscurity, discover our own mission, fulfill it, or betray it. We have the opportunity, as Dr. Eddie Glaude said, in pulling on the wisdom of James Baldwin, that we have the opportunity to begin again. In Princeton, in this country, we have the opportunity to begin again. We can take this compostable material, we can build up our soil, and we can make sure that those seeds that Shirley and Ben and others have been planting can actually grow and bear fruit that will last. So again, thank you all. Thank you all for spending all this time.
I want to say thank you to Pastor Lukata. I told you when I did the introduction that he would give the raw history of Princeton. We need to continue this. And also, I still do the tours and I still do the history. Can't do the tours now, but I do it virtually. But let's keep this going and let's plant those seeds and see them grow. Thank you, Reverend Lukata.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. Blessings to you.
Yes,
thank you.
All. If you wish to unmute and clap or say thank you, please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Te felicito.
Thank you, brother.
Muy
Thank
bien
you,
hecho.
Reverend Lukata.
Thank you, Reverend Lukata.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you,
You are a
Reverend.
blessing to this
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Has been recorded.
Great.
Late.
Thank you, Frank, if you're
Yes.
still on. Frank Bolden.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.
I saw Frank Bolden, Shirley.
Pardon me?
I saw Frank Bolden.
I don't know if he's still on though.
Sound like Barbara.
Yes,
Barbara.
Has been recorded, so we will be posting it.
You have no idea how much I was sitting here wanting to say something, but this was his platform and he did a marvelous job. Happy with that.
I just want to offer everybody an opportunity to catch up a little bit on housekeeping. For those of you who are maybe joining us this evening for the first time, as we said at the beginning, I'm Shelley Krause. I'm one of the board members of Not in Our Town, and we do coordinate with the Princeton Public Library's assistance a conversation on race and white privilege on the first non-holiday Monday of every month. This month it was easy. It was the first. Guess what? Next month it's easy again. It will be March 1st, right back here on Zoom, 7 p.m. Our board member, Caroline Clark, will be speaking about anti-Blackness. It should be a wonderful program. Our friend Fern Spruill said earlier tonight, they didn't teach us this history. I want to encourage those of us who are still here tonight to dedicate some time to thinking about whether you're willing and able to commit to giving voice to the unspoken, as Reverend Mjumbe has so powerfully called us to do. Will you take on responsibility to know the truth, understanding that in many cases it won't happen unless you make it happen, right? To what extent are you willing and ready and able to plant a seed? To what extent are you willing and ready and able to care for it? To what extent are you willing and ready and able to be a seed? Proximity makes a difference.
Leslie wants to be added to the list.
We will add anybody who puts your email on the list. We'll get you on the mailing list. You can get closer. You can listen. You can listen to your heart for where it's breaking. Find the other people whose hearts are aching there, and then gather together and work for change. So please continue to join us. And thank you for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it.
May I add something that you can get more history if you go to PrincetonWJHCS.org. It's the newsletter for the Witherspoon-Jackson community and the Witherspoon-Jackson Historical and Cultural Society. And you can also get the history. It came out today.
All right.
February, March, and April.
Can you repeat that, please? Sorry.
Princeton at WJHCS, Witherspoon-Jackson Historical Cultural Society.org.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.